Hello, everybody. Very happy to introduce the last bunch of our Mcilvanney and Debut Prize shortlisted authors that we've had on all week in the book club. They're going to start us off with an introduction to themselves and their books. Maybe starting with Liam, because you're in the middle.
Thanks very much, Kaz. Well, good to see you. Kia ora from the deep south of New Zealand. So the book that I'm delighted it's been shortlisted is this fellow here, The Heretic, needlessly large, as you can see from the spine. It's a sequel to my 2018 book, The Quaker, and it features the same protagonist, D.I. Duncan McCormick. I sent him away to the Met in London at the end of the Quaker, and I brought him back to Glasgow, and it's now 1975, and he's investigating the death of a former Tory MP and a bomb blast in a pub in the north side of Glasgow. So he's got plenty to keep him occupied.
Sounds good. Sarah?
Yeah, mine is this one here, Hear No Evil, and it's set in 1817 Scotland. It's kind of inspired by a real life case of the first deaf person to ever be put on trial in the High Court in Scotland, and that's a woman called Jean Campbell, who's seen throwing, dropping, pushing her baby from the old bridge in the Gorbals in Glasgow and is arrested there and then taken through to the Tolbooth prison in Edinburgh. Um, and when she gets there, nobody can communicate with her because she doesn't speak, she can't hear, and they're just not very sure how they're going to take her testimony. So they bring in a guy called Robert Kinneborough, again, a real person, and he is tasked with signing to her and getting her through because he's a teacher of deaf children in the Canongate in Edinburgh. So Robert comes in, and then after a few twists and turns, he turns from interpreter to investigator to try and figure out what really happened on that bridge to bring Jean to the point where she was arrested. And so he goes back and forth with that.
So let's start off with how you felt when you got that call to say that you'd been put on the shortlist. What's it like? Where were you when you got the news?
Will I go first? I was in.
Yeah.
And yeah, the person that rang me, I had just done another event involving that person, so I thought that they were phoning about something to do with that, and I didn't really expect it to be about the debut prize. So I was completely taken aback, really chuffed. I've been going to bloody Scotland for a few years as an audience member, so to be kind of on the other side of that and be one of the authors is just fantastic. Um, and to be shortlisted for this prize is amazing. It's just incredibly exciting and fantastic that I don't think that I'm not sure, but when it's your debut novel, you kind of feel as if everything is a bonus, everything is unexpected, it's new and whatever. So yeah, it's brilliant. Really looking forward to going and being, as I said, on the other side of the stage.
No? What about you?
Yeah, I think I got a text just before I went to bed here in New Zealand, and then I woke up and it had all been announced, and so the Twitter was full of it. So yeah, you often get that with the time difference here that you sort of miss things, and then you wake up in the morning and you see that things have happened. But yeah, it was fantastic. I mean, it was a real boost, in fact, because the book was published way back in January in sort of lockdown here, so I haven't done a single live event surrounding the book. So it kind of feels as if you've published the book and it's just kind of dropped into a bit of a hole. So it was nice to sort of get that little boost, and it's a fantastic shortlist. Just feel very honoured to be on it, besides people like Alan Parks and Louise Welsh and Ambrose Parry. So it's yeah, absolutely fantastic.
We've got some hellos. So Laura said hello. Ian Hamilton said hello. He's been looking forward to this chat apparently. And so is Leslie, and Steve is one of our Californian members who's come and said hello to you. So we've got people all over the world taking part and watching. Laura says she's struggling to hear you a little bit, Sarah.
Oh, I'm sorry. My microphone isn't working very well. I'll just have to talk a bit louder. Is that any better?
Yeah, I think that was better. Right, so we've done that. What happens? So when's the prize ceremony? Are you both going to be at it? Liam, are you going to beam in from New Zealand for it?
I don't know actually. I don't. I don't think so. I'm certainly not going to be there anyway. That's for sure. But yes, I'll be an interested observer, I guess, from a distance of 12,000 miles. I'm sure the logistics will be explained to me in due course.
I was just going to say I'm going to be there. It's on the 15th, Thursday, the 15th of September. So I'm going to be there, and I'm doing the debut panel just beforehand. And I'm also really excited that I'm going to be in the Torchlight Parade, which is like very thrilling to imagine that I'll be able to, that I'll be holding a torch, or that I'll be allowed to hold a torch. So that'll be great.
What a fantastic way to kick off a festival, isn't it? You sort of parade through the kind of medieval streets of the old town of Stirling down the hill with your torches. It's absolutely unbeatable.
I mean, if you're going to parade anywhere with torches, probably Stirling's the best place.
It really is, yeah.
It lends itself to that.
Yeah.
It sounds amazing, to be fair, parading down through Stirling and with torches. I would love to go to it. I don't think I can make it this year because I'm at work, but be lovely to be able to go. We've got someone else saying they can't hear you, Sarah.
Right. Do you know what? I'm going to let you guys talk for a minute, and I'm going to see if I can sort this out, okay?
Is this your first time on the shortlist, Liam?
No, I actually was fortunate enough to win the thing in 2018 with the Quaker. And of course I was able to. I was actually in Scotland at the time. We were back for 6 months. I had a period of research leave from my job at the university here, so the timing was fantastic. I was able to actually attend the ceremony and get to lead this torchlight parade down through the streets of the old town of Stirling. And it's just, I mean, most crime festivals, I think, have got a great sort of vibe and really collegial atmosphere, but Bloody Scotland's, I think, a particularly good one from that point of view. The only downside was that I played in the Scottish football team that got beat by the English, by the old enemy. So Mark Billingham's team thumped us, but that was the only downside in the weekend. A fantastic time.
It sounds like there's a lot of unique stuff about Bloody Scotland that you don't get at other crime festivals. You know, like the Torchlight procession and the England Scotland football match. They're not kind of
I think it's partly to do with the fact that Stirling is such a fantastic location for it. I mean, it's such a handsome town physically, but it's also nice and compact, and you really feel. I think if the festival had been in Glasgow or Edinburgh, it might have just got lost in the larger city. But you do really feel that the festival almost kind of puts its stamp on the town for that weekend, and you really feel the place is buzzing, and everywhere you turn there are crime writers. And for someone like me who spends most of my time 12,000 miles away from all the festivals that everyone is enjoying, it's just an absolute joy to be able to partake of that.
Can I just check if that is any better for anybody, or I'll try taking out the headphones and just doing it without?
Maybe try taking out the headphones. While we're waiting, someone said that Leslie has said The Quaker and The Heretic are both fab books.
Well, thanks very much, Leslie. That's very nice to hear. Thank you.
How's that? Is that better, guys?
That is better.
Much better. Yeah.
Right. Useless
Fantastic.
headphones. Sorry about that, folks.
We can hear you now. Yay. What are you both
Good.
working on at the moment then? So what you currently, what can you give us any clues about your current work in progress?
Well, I'm working on book 2, and that's another historical crime-ish novel at the moment. I'm not sure exactly how much is going to be history and how much is going to be crime at the moment, but it's kind of set in Glasgow in 1920 in a backcourt cinema, and it's about a woman and World War One trauma as it kind of relates to the main protagonist and the people that she meets in the cinema. And it's got a heavy dose of the kind of burgeoning appeal of the spiritualist church just after World War One in the city. So I'm just kind of feeling my way through the beginnings of that, really.
That sounds fantastic, Sarah. I'm working on a standalone novel, which I suppose is a kind of psychological thriller about a couple who lose their child is abducted and then returned a few years later, and how they adjust to that. So I'm about 65,000 words through that, and I'm hoping to bring it home at about 80,000 words. So I've just got that final stretch to go, but that always seems to be the stretch that you've got to kind of steel yourself to make that final push. So that's the position I'm in just now, and then I'll do the third Duncan McCormick book hopefully once that's out the way.
Sounds good. We've got some questions coming in from the audience. Laura wants to know, she's asking you one of our favourite group questions, we love asking it because we get such great answers. It's, have you ever acted out a scene to help with the writing process?
I think I act. That's a really interesting question. My younger daughter did acting at college, and we were having a conversation a while back about the fact that I thought that I acted things out in my head. I didn't necessarily physically act them out, but I would have conversations in my head between characters going on, and that was something that I tended to do long before I even started writing. I used to have conversations in my head. I just wasn't really that conscious of them. And I was talking to a friend a few years ago, and I mentioned this, and she was kind of horrified that that was going on. And she said, I've never done that before in my life. And I think some people do it and some people don't. Like, they have this kind of internal monologue going on. And I just assumed that everybody did it until I talked to a friend who said that no, she had never done it. So yeah, I act them out in terms of, I think about what people are saying to each other, and I quite often take myself off to locations and imagine what's going on in a scene, and that tends to help me kind of consolidate what I'm going to write down when I get home.
What a great question. Yeah, I think I probably do a bit of that. Very often I find that if I'm writing a particular scene, the dialogue is the first thing that comes. And then I almost need to sort of add in what the characters are doing. That seems to me just to be one of the kind of technical aspects of writing that can be quite tricky but quite enjoyable. You know, what are your characters doing while they're having this exchange of dialogue? So I like to have them actually doing, you know, if they might be watching a football game or playing snooker or something, that you can actually sort of incorporate the actions that they're doing while they're talking. So that trying to get the body language and the gestures, I think, is quite important. So I do sometimes worry that you know, someone might watch me as I'm writing, as I try to practice the kind of gestures that people might make when they hear a particular piece of news, or are feeling a particular emotion. I must look as if I've gone mad as I sort of sit in front of the computer screen. So yeah, I think I do a bit of that kind of physical acting out of both parts in the dialogue. Brilliant question.
Yeah, so some of the reasons why we've liked it are that we've had authors who acted out fights on Wikipedia. We've had people who've held knives to their throats, tied up their husbands to see if they could escape from a particular knot.
Yeah.
Buried a lamb shoulder in concrete for a year to see what would happen. Yeah,
Superb.
it's amazing what you can
fantastic.
find out about authors for that
question. That's wonderful.
That's incredible. I think that I mean, one of the things that you were talking about, looking at your computer screen and somebody seeing you, like the sort of expression you're making or whatever. I often feel like that when I'm out, because I tend to, a lot of my stuff is written near where I live, so I'll walk, but it's like 200 years ago, 100 years ago, so I'll kind of go and walk the streets and try and imagine what it was like then. And quite often I'll be thinking about something and I'll go past somebody and think I look really miserable or I look really angry, or they're gonna, or I'll be kind of sort of talking to myself a bit, and I kind of have to catch myself on and just say no, just try and act as normal as possible on a crowded street.
Brilliant.
So where do you get the inspiration from for your stories? We were talking to Alan Parks yesterday and he said he walks to find locations, and then sometimes the locations will give him the story idea, and it's just sort of exploring Glasgow that gives him his ideas. What about for you guys? What gives you your inspiration?
Shall I kick off? I mean, my with Hear No Evil, it's inspired by a true story. So it's I worked in an organisation called Deaf Connections for a number of years, and I got to know quite a lot of deaf people and also people doing research into the archives there, and that's where I got the initial idea about the story from. But because I couldn't find anything about the character of Jean in any of the official documentation, that was what kind of inspired me to start writing about it in terms of fiction, because it was really just a way of explaining the story to myself because I couldn't find the facts about it.
I love that idea of sort of the place suggesting plot developments. Alan sort of strolling around Glasgow and the sort of plot springing to life around him as he goes. And we had Peter May out here in New Zealand a few years ago, and I was very struck. But he had a similar process where he would visit all the locations that he was going to write about, and sort of take some footage on his phone and then sort of play that back when he wrote the material. So of course I can't do any of that other than through Google Maps, because I'm 12,000 miles away from Glasgow. So I guess I've got to use my imagination to put myself back in the city. So I suppose my inspiration for rendering the city to some extent comes from sort of archival research and research in newspapers, and particularly if you're writing about a period. So the Quaker was set in 1969, the Heretics in 1975, and it's amazing what you can glean not just from the sort of news articles in the Glasgow Herald from that period, but almost more importantly, the adverts. How much did a three-piece suite cost? What was on the telly and the the TV listings, and a lot of those sort of ancillary elements of the newspaper give you a real sense of the flavour of the place that you're trying to capture.
What are the sort of challenges that you get by having to set your novels back in the past, or choosing to set your novels sort of back in history?
suppose it's about whether or not what you're looking for or what you think you're looking for in terms of archives actually exists. With Hear No Evil, that was set in 1817. So that's before photography or so you haven't got any kind of real visual archive to draw on, and so I tended to go for. I looked at lots of maps of Glasgow and Edinburgh to try and get an idea of what things looked like then, and it was easier in Edinburgh because the Edinburgh Old Town is much more intact. In respect of what it would have looked like in the early 19th century, whereas most of what Glasgow looked like in the early 19th century was swept away during slum clearances, kind of in the mid-Victorian period. So that was slightly more difficult. And what's been interesting, because I've set in my second novel in 1920, is that I've got a whole range of different archives to draw on. So I've been going and looking at silent films and documents from old picture palaces in Glasgow, where I can find out what the price of a ticket costs to get in to see a certain film, or what was showing during the period that I'm writing about. So that's been really useful. But I think it changes depending on what period you're looking at. And sometimes the stuff, as Liam was saying about the adverts, for example, in newspapers, sometimes the stuff that is helpful isn't necessarily what you start off looking for, that you kind of stumble across things that kind of bring the period alive for you.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, I'm in the fortunate position that obviously the period I'm dealing with, unlike Sarah, has a very strong photographic record. But I think Glasgow is particularly well served by, I mean, there are 5 or 6 world-class photographers who are documenting that sort of transition, the redevelopment of the city and the move from inner city tenements to the peripheral housing schemes. So, you know, people like Gérard Depardieu or Oscar Marzaroli. So that there's a fantastic photographic record that you can draw on when you're writing. I think from my point of view, the attraction of writing about Glasgow in that period was partly not writing about Glasgow in the present. So my first 2 books were contemporary political thrillers, I suppose you would call them. Then I started to you know, the longer I lived in New Zealand, the more implausible it was to keep writing sort of topical thrillers set in a city that you haven't really lived in for, you know, for a decade or more. So it was partly the idea that we're kind of all equally distant from Glasgow in the 1960s and 70s, and that it might make sense to move into writing those sort of historical, I don't know if you can call them, I mean, Walter Scott, who basically invents the historical novel with Waverley, or to 60 years since, you know, there's that idea that it's got to be 60 years ago and it's not quite a historical novel. So mine don't quite qualify, but yours certainly do, Sarah.
But I often think that, like, for something like, you know, with Liam's books and Alan Parks's books, I love them because you know, that whole kind of early 70s to late 70s was when I was a little girl in Glasgow. So you know, when I open a book and it's set somewhere that I can vaguely remember, or there's a mention of a restaurant or a cafe that is kind of, you know, I knew, I find that quite exciting. But that's a different experience to say if my daughter's reading it, because she's not got that kind of terms of reference. So it's much more historical for her. It's not really that historical.
That's right. It's historical in different contexts for different readers, isn't it? But that's a very good point. I mean, the Quaker is set in 1969. I was born in 1969, so obviously I don't have particularly vivid memories of that period. This is 75. This book, so I'm starting to, and I'm really enjoying getting into a period where I think, oh, I can actually, you know, start to use my own memory. The next book's 1981. So I'm really enjoying that more of the world of the novel is coming from my own memories rather than from research in newspapers and so on. So I'm quite enjoying that. Of course, you've got a way to go, Sarah, before you bring your story up to up to the present if you're starting.
Yeah,
if you are.
yeah, I did have. I had an idea of a while back of I'd written a short story that was set in 1990, which was Glasgow City of Culture, and it was kind of all sort of set around the big day, which was
Oh,
like
I remember that
you
well.
know,
Yes.
yeah, so do I. And it was bizarre because it was a really short story, but I ended up doing loads and loads of research because I kept feeling like I'd got it wrong. So I would remember something, oh, Billy Bragg was on the stage in George Square, or wait a minute, was he? Was he at Glasgow Green? Was he at the Broomielaw? And I had to ask loads of people to try and remember things like that because I knew lots of people would remember and would see if I'd made a mistake.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think there's
Fantastic.
slightly more pressure the closer it gets.
Yeah, that's true. More people remember and can tell you that you got things wrong, which of course people are never slow to do. So excellent.
I've got Amanda at last.
Can you hear me?
Hi, Amanda.
Hi there.
Hi, Liam. Hi, Sarah.
Hi there.
Join us, Amanda, by telling us a little bit about yourself and your book.
Oh, hello. Well, I'm an expatriate, like Liam, and my book is all about the problems of the Highlands of Scotland and also the problems of Scotland today and how to deal with the fact that you can't make any money on the west coast of Scotland apart from through tourism. So this is my book, and it's about rewilding as well. So the book is set in a dystopian future where there's been a complete closure of Scotland after a pandemic. Are you getting a lot of feedback? Kaz, can you hear me properly?
No, I can hear you, but there's some feedback.
Oh, well, I don't know quite what to do about it, but anyway, the problem really is that after this pandemic and this closure, there's a complete breakdown in Scotland of, if you like, the fabric of society, and it brings out all the worst things in Scottish sort of culture, and also some of the best. And in this new world, a whole estate, in other words, the whole of the Arthur Peninsula has been cut off and rewilded with wolves, bears. And my detective finds, comes to look at a body of a man supposedly mauled to death by a bear, but this proves not to be right. And then he starts to uncover darker and darker, darker reality. Is it now so bad it would be best if I signed off?
Maybe, and try to sign back in again.
Because I'm hearing some thoughts. I'm very sorry to leave you all. Okay, goodbye, and have a great time. And Sarah, love your book. Cheers. Bye.
Thank you.
We had a brief visit from Amanda. I think it's, picking up back on what we were talking about, I think it's really interesting then, like how you would classify your books, because obviously yours is more historical because it is in the, like, so far in the past. But what do you classify yours as? Because they're not really, they're in the past, but like you said, in the recent past that people can remember.
Yeah, and they're becoming, I suppose, less historical. So I suppose, with my academic hat on, as someone who teaches Walter Scott, I do feel that I don't quite cut the mustard as a historical novelist because I'm not beyond those 60 years. So yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, I've given much thought as to what you would call them instead. So yeah, I mean, kind of nearly historical novels, I guess, might be one way to look at it.
Recent
It's quite hard to. Yeah, I was just going to say it's quite hard to sort of categorize things sometimes. I know when I was writing my book, I kept saying to people it's historical crime, just assuming that that was a thing, because it is a thing, because I've read historical crime novels. And then when it was being published, the publisher was sort of saying, well, it's historical, it will be on the because there isn't really a historical crime shelf. It's going to be historical or crime, but it's can also be both. But booksellers have to place it on a particular shelf, and publishers have to market it towards that. So yeah, all of these labels they're kind of handy if you're looking for something, but they can be a bit constraining as well.
I think it's a really interesting thing because I read some amazing novels that have been like speculative crimes sort of set in a near future, and they have been, I think the authors of them have found them really hard to sell because they're kind of the crime, but they could also be sci-fi, and then people don't really know how to like market them. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
you're sort of across those genres, it gets confusing for people, but then people really love things across genres as readers.
And I think also the fact that if it's stuck in a genre that you have got assumptions about that you either like or don't like, you'll gravitate towards it or away from it. I mean, the speculative thing is really interesting because I'm reading Amanda's book at the moment, and because it's this dystopian future, but it's got this kind of police procedural element. It's really interesting and different. And I read another one recently called The Pharmacist by Rochelle Atala. That's another speculative fiction book, and that's a genre that I would have avoided for years and years. I thought that was something that didn't interest me. I thought it was sci-fi. I think I'd been put off that when I was at school and got made to read Brave New World, which I read later on and really liked. But you know that like I had a kind of wrong assumptions about that whole genre. So yeah, it can be really helpful because you can gravitate towards books that are like other books that you like. But on the other hand, it can be kind of damaging because it can pigeonhole people and books in genres that mean that they get a limited readership and that they don't really break out of that.
There seems to be a thing, though, the sort of crossover between crime fiction and speculative fiction as well. So I've been reading Emily St. John Mandel's Sea of Tranquility, and then reading her more recent speculative fiction. But I think her first three novels seem to have been crime novels. So she's obviously made that transition from the crime novel to speculative fiction. So yeah, it's an interesting mashup. I think you're right. It's often where unlikely genres collide that you get the most interesting work.
Yeah, and it's not exactly a new thing either, is it? If you think about things like Blade Runner and stuff in the past, odd of the not too near history, then you know there's been those for a while. I need to read you this comment from Steve William because I can't let it go unread out. He said that you capture the times of the 70s so well. He was a young gay man in the mid 70s, and he thought you really caught the time and the feeling of it.
That's just fantastic to hear, Steve. It's that's the kind of thing that makes writing the stuff worthwhile, and particularly, you know, having to think my way into Duncan McCormick as a gay character in that period was quite a challenge for me because I'm not myself gay, and you're conscious that you've got a duty to try and render that experience as accurately as you can. So I'm heartened and relieved that you think I didn't make a complete mess of that, Steve. Thanks very much for that.
Well, further down, he said it's difficult to express how great it has been to read a real gay lead character.
Excellent. That's great. I mean, I had a brilliant wee session with the Ed and Gay book group, who were able to sort of just give me certain pointers as to, you know, what the period was like, and the kind of pressures and the kind of joys and the various aspects of being gay in that period. And I think that's, you know, I mentioned earlier the importance of archival research in newspapers, but it's also absolutely essential to have people who, particularly if it's a period piece, that you can have, you know, people who were actually alive during the period and experienced it. So I've been very fortunate to have that. And also with the police procedural side of things, I've been able to chat with a couple of detectives who were active in the Glasgow CID at the period I'm writing about. So let's say they've rued the day that they gave me their email addresses as I sort of plague them with questions night and day.
Important.
Yeah, that's.
Go on.
Sorry, Kaz. I was just going to say that's interesting because I've got a deaf main character. I had a similar kind of process to go through because I'm not deaf. So, and although it's 200 years ago, it was really kind of impossible for me to like render that character without going and speaking to deaf people about whether they thought I'd got it right. And yeah, they were really, really helpful in terms of looking at some of the early extracts especially, and just telling me if I'd got it completely wrong, which was it was great. Like if I hadn't had them, I would have got a lot of things wrong, and that might have been printed, which would have been dreadful, because it was really sort of like subtle stuff that just hadn't occurred to me at all. It wasn't the obvious stuff that I thought that I knew, so it was really good to let them have a look at it. And since I've published the book, I've done a couple of deaf book groups, and that's been brilliant because they've just really got, like, the deaf community in Scotland have totally got behind the book and have kind of been, really supportive of it, and also, like, picked holes in what I've said and because a lot of the stuff is assumptions about what signing was like 200 years ago, which nobody really knows. So a lot of it was kind of like, making it up based on where we are now or where we were in the 1950s, and trying to figure out what would have happened before that to get to that point. So yeah, you kind of need folk to have a look at things, don't you, Liam?
Absolutely.
And just kind of, in order just to tell you that you're kind of almost on the right lines, and have somebody to go back and forward. But yeah, again, there's a couple of deaf people that probably totally, their heart sinks when they see my emails pop in with more daft questions.
Do you know, I think people love it though. We have authors who pop into the group and ask a question, and there'll always be someone who can help. There'll always be like an ex-policeman or
and people are quite keen, in my experience. If you've lived experience that's going to be useful to a writer, people are generally very keen to sort of share that experience. So the generosity of people when you ask them to help you with the research always pleasantly surprises me, that people are really keen to share their experience.
And it's true that, like, I used to work in like information services, and that was kind of my mantra, was that if I didn't know, somebody would know. That if you went and you didn't have to kind of sit with a problem on your own. There was always going to be somebody somewhere that would know the answer to the question that you had. It was really just figuring out how to get to that person. And yeah, you're right. Like, there's so many people have really helped me with things like I've got scenes in the book where Jean is in the cell on her own, and she's describing how she feels and what's there, and to be able to give that to a deaf person and say, what what bits of this would you would you recognise? Would you latch on to, and what bits of this am I imposing on that as a hearing person that I can take out in order to make it better, was just absolutely invaluable, really.
Yes, I'm not an author, but I spent a small, tiny part of my day today helping someone with a DNA question for a book, which was quite nice. It's just nice to be able to help people sometimes if you can. We've got a question from Laura a bit further up. She asked, also, apart from the acting out a theme, she asked you which of your characters you'd like to meet for a meal or a drink.
Oh, that's a good question. I think
The
of
look
my
of
two main
contemplation as
characters.
well.
Sorry?
The look of contemplation on both of your faces when I read that.
Oh, I know, because you've got to choose the right one. Because I was thinking, oh, like, would I go out with Robert Kenneborough, who's the interpreter? But I think, because I'd like to talk to him, but I think that I would rather go, if I was going for a really good night out, I think I'd rather go with Jean Campbell. I think we'd have a better time. I think Robert's too serious. I'd have a better night out with Jean Campbell and a sorer head in the morning. Whereas if I went out with Robert, we would be much more well behaved.
Yeah, I think I would certainly go for a pint and a whiskey or two with Duncan McCormick. And the location would be the Park Bar, of course, the sort of capital of the Highlands in Glasgow, although some people in Partick in your neck of the woods might disagree, Sarah. But I'm sure plenty of single malt whiskey would be consumed. The thing I would be most excited about, though, would be to eat some haddock. That's the thing that people say, what do you miss about Scotland? And it's a one-word answer for me, haddock. You can't get, you get some lovely fish down here, you get blue cod and various things, but you've no idea how much I miss a good smoked haddock. So the first thing I do when I sort of step off the plane is eat haddock. Sort of just mainline haddock for as long as I'm in Scotland. So my night out would certainly feature haddock, and it might also feature. We might also bump into Harry McCoy, because one of the bizarre things is that my investigator, my detective Duncan McCormick, lives on Caird Drive in Partick Hill in Glasgow, and Alan Parks' detective Harry McCoy lives round the corner in Gardner Street, which of course we had no idea about. So they're very very close to one another. So we could have them meeting up for a pint as well, I think.
That's really funny, because my the backstory, the kind of the fictional bit of my book that explains what happened in the lead up to the crime is all based in Partick Hill. And
Fantastic.
It's the house in Partick Hill, and it's literally like about 100 metres from both Caird Drive and Gardner Street. So I'm sitting here thinking, what
epicentre of Glasgow fiction. Yeah.
Partick Hill is like this tiny, there's maybe about 5 streets or something, and there are lots of, because I'm sure, is it Carol Ramsey? I think her police station is called Partick Hill Police Station. Right. If I remember correctly.
There's a thesis to be, clearly there's a PhD thesis to be written on Partick Hill in fiction.
And it was great. It was great from my point of view, because it was here in 1817. So all the rest of it, the Caird Drives and the Gardner Street, were all Victorian. Yeah. But there was maybe about 3 or 4 houses in Partick Hill, and they were the well-to-do people stayed there, because it was the hill looking down onto Partick, where the working class people stayed. So so it was that was kind of why I picked it, was because I thought, well, I know that those 3 houses were there, so I can kind of make a story around that and reimagine it without all of the other kind of Victorian tenements around it.
Fantastic.
But yeah, it's very strange that it keeps popping up.
Haven't your detectives met in fiction?
Yes. So we've had a wee cameo, of my guy appearing in one of Alan's books, and Harry McCoy appears in the Heretic. So yeah, I think we thought, well, it was partly because when I was back in 2018, I got quite friendly with Alan, but we also spent a lot of our time in the Mitchell Library, which is the great reference library in Glasgow that Sarah will know well, looking through the sort of microfilms of the Glasgow Herald for the 1970s. So it sometimes felt as if we were kind of writing the same. Maybe it feels that to readers as well, that we're kind of writing the same book. So we thought it'd be nice just to take that a wee bit further and have wee cameo roles for our detectives in our respective books. So it's been a bit of fun, but it was really good fun to write.
Maybe
It
that
came up-
could be sort of like a competition through bloody Scotland, that eventually everybody's characters will kind of overlap into other people's books.
Yeah,
Like some kind
fantastic.
of quest.
Yeah. The key to all mythologies. Brilliant.
It would be great, wouldn't it, if like one of the shortlists one year had everyone have a detective making a cameo in each other's books.
Fantastic.
Oh, that's a
Yeah.
challenge.
Uh-huh.
I'm going to lay that down. I don't know if Fiona's watching, but if she catches up, Fiona, there you go. A message for you. Someone said that Peter May, for his book, The Critic, enrolled in a winemaking course in France. So he does some serious research.
Oh, win-win. That sounds like a fantastic one, doesn't it?
It does. It's like top research, that, isn't it?
Mm.
What when you're researching for your books, what's kind of the most interesting research rabbit hole you've been down?
Well, I suppose I mean, the Quaker was based on the real life Bible John murders that took place in Glasgow in 1968 and 1969. So that, I mean, that's obviously a very well travelled rabbit hole, but I suppose that was that's a case that has fascinated me for years. So I think sort of going a little further down that rabbit hole was both fascinating and sort of horrifying at the same time.
Yeah, I think probably the deaf history stuff was the thing that well, it was the thing that started the book off, but that was brilliant because so much of that is so little known that it's kind of it seemed to me that there were these historical events that were happening in tandem with historical events that I knew about, but I didn't know about all of the deaf history stuff. So that was really interesting because I had like loads of assumptions about how sign language developed and how deaf community came together, and how the different I thought that I understood quite a lot about sign language until I started researching the history of it and realised I understood very little at all about. There's this amazing graphic that shows how internationally all the different sign languages have developed within kind of groups. So I had made an assumption that, I think somebody told me years ago, that Irish and American Sign Language was really similar and British Sign Language is very different. And then I saw this graphic and I found out that actually Irish Sign Language has more in common with French Sign Language than it does with either American or British. And I think that as a hearing person, I had always assumed that there was some kind of like homogeny to sign language worldwide that doesn't exist, because it obviously it developed in all these different pockets. So that was really, really interesting. And just finding out why, I'm completely obsessed with the differences in sign language dialects, like why you've got in Glasgow, for example, you've got historically you had Catholic Sign Language and Protestant Sign Language, totally different from each other, using totally different signs. And when deaf people started telling me about this, I thought that they were winding me up, but they weren't winding me up at all. And when you say that, it kind of makes sense, but it doesn't make sense. And so all of that sort of stuff, like why one word is signed in slightly different ways by different people, is just brilliant and really fascinating. And eventually I have to stop looking at it and trying to describe it in the book because it just got too unwieldy.
It does sound fascinating,
Mm.
to be fair. So I'm going to ask you some of our group favourite questions now. Well, we're going to start off with one of my favourite author chat questions, which is, would you ever make a graphic novel version of one of your books?
Oh, I'd quite like to. I mean, somebody would have to do the drawing because I'm not good at that. But yeah, I'd really like to because I think from the sign language point of view that, you know, loads of deaf people are really big graphic novel fans and really like all that visual stuff. And recently I was involved with it doing this project for the Edinburgh Book Festival where there was a performance of some of the extracts from my book put on by deaf actors. And so, and that was really interesting to see how they, because they were on stage and it was visual, how they did it differently to how I had done it on the page. So yeah, that would be brilliant. Yeah, I'd love to do that.
I would absolutely jump at the chance to do that. It would be fantastic. Partly because I still think that my understanding of narrative derives in large part from Ur Wullie and the Bruins, which are these cartoons that appeared in the Sunday Post. And then every year you would get an annual at Christmas time. It would either be Ur Wullie or the Bruins. And Bruins were okay, but Ur Wullie was my favourite. So this was, the adventures of a sort of young boy in a kind of fictional Scottish town. I was Maurice Duncan. He's always started off and sitting in a bucket, and the final scene would be him sitting back in his bucket, and he would get this adventure in between. But yeah, I'm quite sure that I read those voraciously as a boy, and I'm quite sure that my sense of narrative, and that I think they call it the gutter, don't they, between, the space between the frames of the drawings in a comic and just what you can leave out, and people make sense by sort of, filling in the gaps, if you like, as they see what's happening. That's a really useful lesson for narrative, that, the more stuff you leave out, the better in many ways, which of course is the principle enunciated by George Young, who nobody ever knows who George Young is, but Malcolm and Angus were his wee brothers. But he described Malcolm's rhythm guitar playing with the phrase, "It's the stops what rocks," which to me is the greatest aesthetic principle ever enunciated. It's the stops what rocks. It's the stuff you leave out that gives momentum to your prose. I think I learned that from Ur Wullie. So yeah, a graphic novel would certainly be something I would love to do.
And I think
Yeah, I love the Bruins more than Ur Wullie, although yeah, similarly I got the annuals every year, and it was 1 year Ur Wullie, 1 year the Bruins.
That's right,
wasn't
yeah.
it? And we had a very regimented childhood. But I really liked the Bruins because, I mean, I liked Ur Wullie, but I liked the Bruins because there were so many characters,
Yep.
and they were so distinct from each other. And you know, they were kind of, they were sort of archetypes, but they were just like very good. I liked the mischief in it. You would always find everybody would be rushing about trying to sort out some kind of problem, like somebody was going to the pictures with somebody else's bird, and there was a whole kind of like kerfuffle that had to be sorted out. And you would get in the corner like sort of grandpa and the bairn just like chuckling about something or like getting up to some kind of mischief. I really liked it. It's a bit like your thing about the gutter thing. It was the stuff that was going off to the side, right, that would always kind of draw my eye.
Fantastic.
There's a really rich history of like crime authors writing and producing kind of good graphic novels as well, isn't there? They've written for like quite big sort of series and things. I think both Denise Mina and Ian Rankin have written for Hellblazer, for instance. So it does exist. There is that sort of crossover there. The other one of our group's favourite questions, we've got 5 minutes left, so it's a nice one to kind of finish off with, is what are your most memorable moments as an author so far?
Right, can I have two?
Yes.
Because I'm only a debut author, so I've only been doing this since February this year. But the one that I mentioned before about doing the performance for the Edinburgh Book Festival was incredible, because that was something completely unexpected and different. And it was a chance to collaborate with actors and directors and whatever. And I had no idea that that was going to happen. And so it was kind of scary and very, very rushed, but ultimately incredibly satisfying. But my other one was I got asked to go to the Borders Book Festival. I don't know if Liam's been to that
I
before,
haven't, no.
but my publicist said, you've been asked to go to the Borders Book Festival. Can you go on this day? And I said, yeah, that's fine. And she said, oh, that's fantastic. I was expecting her to give me all the details of what I would be doing, who I'd be talking to, all that kind of practical stuff. And all she said was, apparently the hospitality is amazing. And so I had no idea what that meant. So I went down there, and it was just the most bizarre weekend, because the hospitality is indeed amazing. But it's the kind of place where all the authors are is this kind of small old house in the middle of a kind of country estate that's filled with marquees where the events are going on, and it's just wall to wall celebrities. So I spent my Saturday and Sunday WhatsApping my friend, just with like, eventually I started explaining what was going on, but eventually I just started sending her things like, I would just go, Miles Jupp, Jack D, Joanna Lumley, and she was saying, you're having a laugh. And I'm not having a laugh, I've just spoken to them. And so it was just this like huge list of all of these people. So that was very strange and good fun.
That sounds amazing. What about you, Liam?
Well, I'm trying to think. I mean, one of the most memorable experiences happened quite recently in a bookshop in Dunedin, Paper Plus, where for the first time in my life I saw someone about to buy my book. There was an old guy sort of in the queue with a copy of The Heretic. I was with my wife, and I was just going to leave it, and my wife said, "No, you've got to say, who you are and so on." And I should have known that it wouldn't end. It wouldn't end well. But anyway, the guy bought his book, and I sort of jumped in front of him and said, "Oh, I couldn't help but see you bought my book. Happy to sign it." And he was like, "What, your book?" I said, "Yes, I wrote it." "Your book?" I said, "Yes, I'm. That's me. I'm Liam Mcilvanney." To which he then uttered the immortal line, "No, you're not. He's dead." So where do you kind of go from there? It was like, no, I'm here. I'm still alive. So I finally managed to persuade the guy that I was indeed Liam Mcilvanney and still alive, and signed his book. But let's say it didn't quite go. The experience didn't quite go the way I expected. But the most memorable experience was undoubtedly the one we've mentioned already. The leading the torchlight parade after winning the Mcilvanney Prize at bloody Scotland. That was just such a perfect day. I was in Stirling with my wife, and we had a lovely meal, and then went to the event. It was just one of these days that you think that day will never be better. That's one of these days that you just file away and think, yep, that's the one. So that would certainly be the highlight, and will probably remain the highlight for many years to come, I think.
Good answers. And can you finish off for us, because we've got a minute left, by telling us a little bit about your books again, so that people know what they're going to go and buy if they haven't already.
Okay, shall I? Right, this is Hear No Evil. It's a historical crime book set in 1817, Glasgow and Edinburgh, and it's all about what really happened to Jean Campbell, who was the first deaf person to be put on trial in Scotland, when just after she was arrested for throwing her baby, or did she, off the old bridge in the Gorbals in Glasgow.
And this is The Heretic, which is the continuing adventures of D.I. Duncan McCormick, the second book in, I think, what will probably be 4 books about Duncan McCormick, set in 1975 in Glasgow.
And then all that's left for me to say is thank you so much for joining us, and best of luck to both of you.
Thanks very much for having me.
Kaz.
Lovely to meet the pair of you. Thanks so much.
Yeah, likewise. Cheers.